Chapter 5. Clashing Historiographies, Uncovering Values in SLA Science Making.
All history is revisionist history.
James M. Banner, Jr. Perhaps the most perplexing clash of opinions in SLA can be found outside of its main scope, in its historiographical accounts. As we can appreciate in the epigraph, this is not surprising for historians. After all, even when historical facts remain unchanged, much like scientific facts, they will gain new meanings as new values emerge in society. For example, an LGBT human rights treatment of World War II could not be possible in any meaningful way in the 1950s. Additionally, even when historical facts remain unchanged, much like in science, people will choose which facts to pay attention to, and which to dismiss. As history gets cherry-picked and assigned with new meanings by different people, we get a better idea of what values are held and by whom. This is why inquiry into the historiographical accounts of prominent scholars in SLA will undeniably complement our understanding of the field. I compile and summarize some of these accounts in Table 2, and subsequently provide my own analysis of these diverse positions, based on the case for consensus building I put forward in this book. Table 2. Historiographical accounts by influential authors in SLA. Historiographical accounts. Summary of positions.
Larson Freeman, 2018. The past and present is characterized by a teleology ideology, tensions between cognitive and social takes, as well as generalizations that do not apply to any individual learner. The ideal future is one where we realize social and cognitive factors, as well as all the relationships we study are ever-changing, where we pay more attention to particular contexts and where we can extend research findings beyond a single study without the need for sweeping generalizations, focusing instead on particularization. This ideal future also entails addressing not only how, but also why languages are acquired, and which varieties, leading to a need to examine issues of social injustice. Ortega, 2019. The past is characterized by essentialist ontologies, and by negative ideologies, that treat learners' language as deficient in comparison to L1 speakers due to historical influences such as the creation of nation-states that brought along the idea of standard languages, and by extension, the monolingual bias and native speakerism. The ideal future is one where we employ non-essentialist ontologies, recognize the diverse routes to multilingualism, and the need to adhere to the ideals of social justice, in light of the rise of authoritarianism in the world.
Van Patten et al., 2020c. Van Patten 2020b. Early SLA behaviorist takes could not account for the development of second languages. The Chomskyan cognitive revolution led to generative theories like Krashen's hypotheses, which have and continue to influence SLA theory development, and although they are not facts, they mostly remain as valid observations. In SLA there are some basic L2 acquisition facts that do not depend on any theory, the exception being the exact nature and mechanisms involved in explicit and implicit learning, where there is conflicting evidence and no consensus. What has not been explained or agreed upon is irrelevant for teaching, as all theories agree there are constraints on language acquisition and a clear need for input, regardless of particular explanations. In the end, theories will coexist, because they explain different aspects of acquisition, not all of acquisition.
Gass, Lowen and Plonsky, 2021. SLA's past is characterized by identity transitions, from a strong connection with L2 teaching, to an identity crisis, to a period where it shows signs of being an independent field. This has been accompanied by more advanced statistical approaches, which are an indication of disciplinary rigor. The ideal future is one where quantitative rigor and sophistication continues to improve, especially when it comes to a focus on magnitude, rather than statistical significance, transparency, replication, and reproducibility in the context of the open science movement.
R. Ellis, 2021. SLA has been characterized by the adoption of theories from other fields, from mirroring L1 acquisition research to an expansion period, to a cognitive phase, to the social turn, and then CDST and the multilingual turn. The field has to some extent gone from applied to basic, while there is a strong case for an applied view. There is no unifying theory, nor is there agreement about the boundaries of the field. CDST is seen by some as a possible unifying framework, but there are caveats. The theory focuses too much on use, does not attempt to generalize, and has not been, and may not be successful in creating methods to operationalize its requirement to take into account a large number of variables. Cell A is still at an early age of becoming a discipline, P201, and useful theories should not be criticized only because they are not scientific. A comprehensive framework may eventually emerge, but the ideal near future is one where SLA remains not as a pure science, but as an applied and transdisciplinary one that gets informed by many sources and is able to provide insights for L teaching.
Holstein, Tweed-Isendry and Twintig.
The first phase of SLA consisted of mostly interlanguage studies, followed by a more thriving phase of interdisciplinarity. There has been a transition from structuralism to generativism, and then to language as a complex adaptive system. SLA is in a healthy state of Darwinian variability, but no fruitful work can be produced if researchers from different epistemological stances attempt to work together, or if they do not agree on the importance of qualitative versus quantitative research. Language as a complex adaptive system can provide a unifying theoretical framework for fruitful transdisciplinary collaboration. An ideal future is one where research observes participants of more diverse backgrounds, learning situations, and typologically different languages through transdisciplinary collaboration.
Ethics and theory.
It seems apparent in Table 2 that different scholars highlight different aspects of second language acquisition research based on different values. Larson, Freeman, and Ortega seem to agree on the need to attend to issues of social justice, which would reshape traditional categories and lead to an overall theoretical revision of the field, along with a significant revision of past research methodologies. Ethics seem to be a new frontier in Cell A. A challenging one, as I tried to exemplify above with the clash between the ethical need to be sensitive to cultural differences between languages and the unethical practice of making clear-cut divisions of cultures and varieties of languages. So native speakerism is both ethical and unethical. It is hard to refute issues of social justice need attention in SLA, but the resulting philosophical conundrums, and in turn the epistemological and methodological ones that we could foresee, require us to reinvent research practices, and to engage more actively with the philosophy of science, and with meta-scientific studies. This requires more than some attention, but hard work which should perhaps be better characterized as both an effort to improve scientific rigor and as advocacy. In other words, taking these calls to tackle issues of social justice in SLA seriously would require us to take on a gigantic challenge, to shake the very foundations of linguistics and psycholinguistics.
Scientifically informed practice.
When it comes to Van Patten et al. 2020 Celsiuses, and Van Patten 2020 billions, they seem to focus on practical and scientifically informed takeaways for pedagogy, as per their assessment of SLA research. So the values could be interpreted as scientific evidence and informed application. I think it is interesting that although they seem to spend a lot of time establishing the superiority of cognitivist takes over structuralism and behaviorism, which are prominent in many teaching contexts, they seem to stop there as far as theoretical clashing is concerned, leaving discussions about the pedagogical significance of socio-cognitive approaches UB, SCT, CDST unaddressed.
Statistical rigor.
Gass, Lowen and Plonsky 2021, stress important points about transparency, replication and reproducibility, so they seem to value rigor and integrity of research. However, for some reason in their historiographical account, more advanced statistical methods are somewhat equated with more rigor, in disregard of the many controversies in contemporary theoretical statistics, which are intensely debated. See Mayo 2018, see also Acrete 2021. Not to mention the fact that L2 theories ultimately govern methodology, interpretation and, by extension, what can or cannot constitute quantitative rigor. In fact, I would characterize this emphasis on one-size-fits-all orthodox statistical practices as one of the problems with the status quo of research training. In my transition from L2 teaching to postgraduate academia, I very quickly noticed, both in the literature and in interactions with other people, that many researchers seem to think statistical results are a given study's main finding, or at least its main epistemic strength. That inferential statistics produce empirical evidence. The problem with this view is not only that it is incorrect by definition, but that it ultimately leads to wildly different, epistemologically incompatible research designs being simultaneously validated somewhat magically, and given the same amount of epistemic prestige only because of what is perceived as always objective and infallible. Statistical procedures. Even studies about obvious pseudoscientific phenomena like seeing the future have been published in journals of psychology, because of this conflation of mathematical inference with empirical evidence, such as the early precognition work of Darrell Boehm. This embarrassing episode in the history of science was reported in a number of newspapers. So, while many of us understand quantification is key, crucial, or even a requirement to make many scientific claims, connecting research rigor with statistical sophistication in essence prioritizes methodological rigor over ontological and theoretical rigor. That means to be very good at measuring, without exactly knowing what we are measuring in the first place, whether that thing exists, see Zhao, 2023, or how it exists, whether it is measurable, and what our numbers allow us to explain, particularize, generalize, predict, manipulate, or turn into practical solutions or recommendations. If we do not put these ontological issues at the top of our priorities, then we have no tools to determine whether our methods are useful or not. And in not prioritizing ontology and theory, we risk engaging in a sort of circular logic. These data are impressive. Why? Because we employed a very valid method. Why is the method valid? Because we have impressive data to prove it. In a word, statistical results have to be analyzed extra-statistically, beyond benchmarks, based on multiple sources of evidence to get ontology right, and on some explanatory framework that can tell us how to interpret the data, as I exemplified above with a discussion on the themes of trends versus variation, see Chapter 3. Jan Hulstein, although not addressing quantification specifically, seems to hold a somewhat comparable opinion.
Observations in themselves don't mean anything. Observations must be interpreted. Interpretation is a kind of theory construction. When I look at the abstracts of conference presentations, e.g. Oslo conferences of the last decade, I notice that only in a small minority of them the reported research is embedded in a theoretical context.
Jan Hulstein, Personal Communication, December 29, 2023.
Theoretical rigor.
In his historiographical account, Hulstein 2023 pays attention to theoretical shifts. He seems to value theoretical rigor and scientific explanation. Thus he focuses on the incompatibility of researchers with different epistemological stances, and the need for a unifying theoretical framework in order for transdisciplinary research to be productive. He does not dismiss the role of exploration, but rather adopts a view that science works in cycles of exploration and explanation. The idea is that we need to explore and find the puzzles, but at some point we must explain what we see and test it, which in turn may create new puzzles. My position would only differ from Hulstein's, in that I do not think that arriving at a valid unifying paradigm will be as simple as choosing one of the available theories, or waiting for one to survive, while letting other approaches fade into unexistence. For me, the question is how to validly test theories when there is more than one scientific tradition, and my proposal is social action towards communication and theoretical integration. Because in a pre-paradigmatic science, there is no valid agreement as to what can be considered a puzzle, and historically such agreement has been dependent on ignoring other people with different ideas. Could we really think of that as theoretical rigor? I do not think so. Often those other ideas come back renewed to haunt a paradigm. I should mention Hulstein adopts a strong Popperian stance to the philosophy of science. But my worry is that Popper, as a committed objectivist, may not be the best source of insight into scientific disagreement. To be clear, Popper was not a positivist with a naive cumulative conception of evidence, and he harshly criticized positivists for valuing verifiability over falsifiability. Yet his idea that the objectivity of scientific statements lies in the fact that they can be intersubjectively tested, Popper 2005, p. 22 was based on the assumption that scientists should simply go beyond their own individual pre-paradigmatic theories and communicate to agree on how to test scientific claims and interpret the results, which, as Kuhn 2012 demonstrated, there is no indication in history that this is a given. Popper saw Kuhn's historicism as too deterministic. The past does not need to repeat. I would agree. However, SLA does not resemble Popper's ideals, but Kuhn's descriptions, as it clearly remains a pre-paradigmatic field. I should clarify here that Kuhn used the word paradigm in different ways, confusing some people as to whether we could talk about pre-paradigmatic sciences, because sometimes he seemed to be saying all scientists operate through some sort of paradigm. But regardless of precision in word choice, the fact that science can exist in a crisis of unsettled fundamentals lives on as a central feature of Kuhnian thought, for example in his idea of periods of extraordinary science, when a finding challenges the fundamentals of an existing paradigm. Ultimately, pre-paradigmatic, extraordinary or neither, the epistemic problem remains: if the fundamentals are unsettled, there is no possible cycle, but instead a fragmented field. One that, I would add, runs the risk of being largely mediated by epistemic trends and fads, by what is in a way fashionable or publication-friendly at a certain period in time. But while it seems I am showing a preference for Kuhn over Popper, I should clarify that this is only the case as to the diagnosis of the problem. Popper is known for his shoudisms, while Kuhn actually studied concrete cases of disagreement during scientific revolutions throughout history, gaining insights into how and why scientists disagree. Yet, my hope in the following chapters is to devise a way to live up to the intersubjective testing to which Popper proposed we should aspire, although based on social understandings of science making that Popper bitterly rejected.
The needs of the real world.
Ellis 2021 seems to share with Van Patten an interest in SLA providing useful insights for practice, so this seems to be an important value to him, to the degree that he does not see a problem with useful theories remaining unscientific. Thus he seems to differ from Van Patten in the importance of scientific evidence, but also on additional fronts. For example, while Van Patten makes the case that research is not necessarily conducted to directly inform teaching, Rod Ellis gives preference to a more applied view of SLA. Their assessment of the status quo is also different because Rod Ellis does not seem to believe SLA is characterized by the existence of facts that are considered facts through all theories, but instead believes the field has not even become a discipline yet. I originally had a hard time understanding why Rod Ellis, having spent his entire career researching L2 acquisition, placed usefulness over scientific integrity, until I met him in person at an international conference. In his presentation, he discussed the difference between conformist styles of curriculum design and radicalist ones, the former being those who succumb to the power of standardized testing, grammar as content and so forth, and the latter being those who actually take steps to ensure their students can communicate in their target language. When the floor was open for questions, I asked him whether the problem was actually theoretical incoherence, as we simply do not seem to be able to get rid of structuralism and behaviorism in L2 education and the L2 industry. Since textbooks, testers, teachers and scholars rely each on different theories and views on language, could the problem be the fact that we do not operate through what Kuhn would call a normal science, which could inform all of them in a coordinated manner? A portion of his answer was surprising. As an L2 teacher, I thought of it as extremely liberating, but as a novice SLA researcher it seemed a bit concerning.
Please throw SLA off the window and focus on education.
Rod Ellis, Personal Communication, March 9, 2024. I would caution the reader not to take this comment too literally, or to quote it out of context, but instead understand this is a rhetorical resource to enhance clarity and assertiveness. He emphasized these helpful concepts of conformist and radicalist do not come from SLA, but from education, which is a field we should pay more attention to. I understood there and then that his strictly applied view of the field is informed by a sensitivity to particular contexts and to the challenges of real-life application being teaching, that is. During his presentation he criticized a view of teachers as technicians, which in my view very much humanizes teachers, and instead stressed the need to be flexible and adapt. He compared curricula to recipes, that can change according to taste, and which produce a different dish every single time. I could not help but to notice these views largely overlap with some of the ideas and justifications Larson Freeman 2018 offers for a complexity theory in SLA, despite the surface disagreements. Dialogue can always be productive, and I hope this short interaction can exemplify this.
Generalization and particularization, different values.
Two of the scholars I have just referred to also differ in one important epistemological issue, with Larson Freeman advocating for particularization, and Rod Ellis advocating for generalization. However, while many of us see the value in particularization, which is a newer epistemology in SLA that may lead to important advancements, breaking away from a history of sweeping generalizations through limited evidence, it is not immediately apparent to me that these two concepts make a good dichotomy. To generalize means to state what is not particular, just as to particularize means to state what is not general. It is not so much that these two notions overlap, but instead that they are logically tied together. One ultimately leads to the other, in what, in a sense, is not two processes but one. This distinction comes from philosophical stances on traditional notions of reductionism and mechanisms in science, see Chapter 8. But my argument in this chapter is that it may also come from certain underlying values. Because generalization is traditionally perceived almost as a requirement for science-making, where it may represent a guarantee of simplicity and predictability, and by extension utility and operationalization. Longino 1990 sees these desirable characteristics of knowledge as some of the underlying values in science. Following our theme that Rod Ellis values utility, it would be easy to understand why he would prefer to advocate for generalization. Indeed, if everyone is similar in some way, we know what to do and how to act when it comes to application and decision-making. We have clear, straightforward, useful scientific principles. But if everyone and everything is inherently particular and dissimilar, then it becomes more difficult to understand how this could aid decision-making. Particularization, on the other hand, may represent other values such as a sensitivity not only to context, but also to each individual's experience, which should not be neglected only because it differs from the average or from the privileged groups that remain overrepresented in science. Following our theme that Larson Freeman values social justice, it would be easy to understand why she would prefer this view. Other deeper epistemological ideals may further drive the desire to particularize, for example, the need to account for dynamic change and non-permanence, or the realization that in order to explain phenomena, we may not need to hold on to what might be underlying apprehensive ideals like essentialism, normativity, the illusions of absolute certainty, accurate prediction, and the desire to control reality rather than to accept its uncertain nature. From my perspective, in arguing for and against generalization, we often mix the science with the application, that is, the information that may be true with the information that may prove to be useful. A matter I discuss in Chapter 7, but at least two things seem clear. One, proponents of both of these epistemological positions agree on the need to be sensitive to contexts and individual differences, as well as to extend findings beyond particular studies, and two, the main logical relationship between generalization and particularization stands. One leads to the other in what may be one single classification process. I also have noticed subtle signs of the straw man fallacy 10 in arguments from both sides. Arguments for particularization seem to assume that generalization in science is equal to absolute generalization, as if scholars who support generalization did not understand or accept at all that exceptions and variability exist when trying to arrive at generalizing claims. Similarly, arguments for generalization seem to assume particularization means absolute particularization, where no trends, commonalities, or principles are looked for. Through experience and looking at the SLA literature, one does get the sense that general and particular traits in learners may be rare in their absolute versions, that is, general to all or unique to a single individual, and they may relate to each other in ways which are not simple, so dispensing with either side of the spectrum does not seem to be epistemically advantageous. Not only that, medical doctors have already found a way to integrate the two. Every time we see a list of symptoms for a certain disease, we are aware that although the list contains several items, in our personal case the disease will manifest in a particular way, maybe 2 to 4 of those items. Same with side effects for medicines. In this quotidian experiences we have no problem understanding and accepting certain things are general and particular at the same time. What is more, the generalized part does not cancel the possibility of particular manifestations, and the particular and unpredictable parts do not seem to cripple our ability to understand and solve the problem through general principles. The same may go for generalization and particularization in L2 development.
The status quo of L2 studies, alarming or reassuring?
When it comes to the way the status quo in SLA is described by different researchers, we also see a rather big opinion gap, as some scholars seem to favor it and be fairly comfortable with it, with some things to improve, while others see somewhat alarming and very widespread theoretical, methodological, and ethical problems. Are we looking at the same evidence, the same field, the same history? Yes and no. Neither historical facts nor scientific bodies of research can so simply mean the same thing for different people. Some people may think the differences in historiographical accounts are caused by different researchers specializing in different aspects of SLA. I would not disagree, but I offer that there are historical and biographical factors that shaped each researcher's values and ideas about L2 acquisition, which ultimately led them to specialize in their particular section of SLA. This is true for all of us. In my case, as a career teacher and especially as a graduate student, the more I read about SLA, the more I became confused and disillusioned with what I began to perceive as a pseudoscientific status of the L2 sciences. I somewhat naively assumed that by the 21st century, I could simply tap into a basic science that could inform not just teaching, but other issues outside of my occupation. What I found instead is a plethora of clashing opinions among quite a small group of people. This led me to a journey into works in contemporary philosophy of science, and that is why I approach SLA the way I do. My values have changed, from taking sides and trying to figure out who is more scientific and rigorous, to focusing on remaining as neutral as possible, and observing how science works, why people came to hold their views, what it would really take for science to be rigorous, and what could be the balance between intellectual curiosity and the responsibility to contribute to social welfare. I wish more researchers would explicitly express their values in this way, something I learned from Oreskes' 2019 Because some scientists seem to be under the impression that their biographies are irrelevant to science, when in fact their personal histories and resulting values fundamentally drive and shape what they do every day, which in turn has an impact on science. This may prove to be one of the reasons why scientific opinions are incommensurable at times. Some scientists also seem to think we should limit our focus to the scientific matters at hand, to the evidence. I agree, but in my mind, focusing on the evidence requires a deeper view of the social and philosophical foundations on which our conceptions of evidence rest, something I learned from Longino 1990. Not merely the superficial material evidence that may mean everything or nothing, and which without deep collective analysis, trans-theoretical conversations, informed disagreement, and coordinated testing, we are left with very little to tell the difference. My final comment about values is that, while researchers hold clashing views on many issues and have different overall priorities, their values do not seem to be mutually exclusive. Social justice, scientifically informed practice, methodological rigor and open science, explanation and theoretical rigor, useful contributions to education. But the range of this spectrum is only a small fraction of what it could be, if more communities were to contribute to theoretical development, which is why I insist more pluralism and coordination seem key, right now and going forward.
Summary of propositions in Chapter 5.
Different scholars provide considerably different takes on the history of SLA, a testament to how values shape perceptions. Even when historical or scientific facts remain unchanged, they will mean different things for different people. They will also be put at the front of the conversation in selective ways. As history gets cherry-picked and assigned with new meanings, one can get a general idea of what values are held and by whom. In SLA, some of the values of scholars who have shaped the field are social justice, scientifically informed practice, quantitative rigor, open science, explanation, theoretical rigor, useful contributions to education. Issues of social justice and ethics, when taken seriously, mean a fundamental change at the very foundations of linguistics and psycholinguistics. Scientifically informed practice as a value has to contend with the theoretical inconsistency of the field, and with a lack of consensus. Statistical rigor as a value has to contend with the statistics wars, in theoretical statistics, with the replication crisis, and with the fact that L2 theories ultimately decide what can be measured and what cannot. Theoretical and ontological rigor determine the value of quantification, and not the other way around. Scientific explanation as a value finds its limits in the lack of a paradigm, wherein scholars cannot fully agree or disagree while communicating in the same language. Epistemological commitments to generalization and particularization may also partially find their origins in particular values. However, both epistemologies are connected as they are part of the same process of finding out what is general and what is particular, where lacking either side of the spectrum does not seem epistemically advantageous. Values are important because they underlie the experiences and motivations of researchers, which has a real impact in science, providing differing viewpoints that need to be negotiated. Focusing exclusively on the evidence dismisses the social and philosophical foundations on which particular conceptions of evidence rest. Particular facts and evidence may mean nothing or everything. Without a process of deep collective analysis, trans-theoretical conversations, informed disagreement and collaborative testing, we are left with very little to tell the difference. The values identified in this section may not be mutually exclusive, but they are also not the result of sufficient worldwide diversity, which is the reason why epistemic pluralism and coordination are key.